History as it happens, June 29th, 2021. The Commission.
Let's have trial by combat.
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved. I immediately deployed the National Guard and federal law enforcement to secure the building and expel the intruders.
Former President Trump's actions preceded the riot for a disgraceful dereliction of duty.
Senate Republicans chose loyalty to Donald Trump rather than support establishing a commission to investigate the January 6 mob attack at the U.S. Capitol. Next, we'll speak to a member of the 9/11 Commission about why our nation needs the facts, all the facts about what happened, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, we do believe there ought to be a commission to go forward. They almost assiduously avoided the two words that are vital to finding out what happened on January 6th, Donald Trump.
If you look at the history of these independent commissions, they take forever to make recommendations. What we needed was a quick solution to the problem on security and pursuit of those who broke the law, which the Justice Department assures me is going on very, very aggressively.
Back in January, we witnessed history as it happened, all right.
Today, millions of Americans are armed to protect the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic.
It is still surreal. It probably always will be, watching those scenes from January 6th, and to Mitt Romney and Mitch McConnell, to name two senators, who and what motivated the mob was not in doubt.
Now we gather due to a selfish man's injured pride and the outrage of supporters who he has deliberately misinformed for the past 2 months and stirred to action this very morning.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day.
Although we watched it unfold on TV and have been reading about it for months now, we don't have all the facts yet. But as we know, Congress cannot agree on creating a commission to investigate. Senate Republicans blocked it. So now Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she'll move toward establishing a select committee in the House to do the job.
Our temple of democracy was attacked by insurrectionists. You know all of this. The gleeful desecration of the Capitol resulted in multiple deaths, physical harm to over 140 members of law enforcement, and terror and trauma among staff, workers, and members.
But again, the initial idea was to establish a commission that could rise above partisan politics, if that is possible, similar to the 9/11 Commission a couple of decades ago. Its 585-page final report is still available online. It is the official record of what happened. But let's not forget there was some controversy over the way the 9/11 Commission was put together, whether it could be independent and willing to get to the truth, especially if that truth were to damage President Bush's re-election chances in 2004. Cooperation was an issue, too. The Bush White House did not allow National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice to testify before the commission for weeks. She finally did on April 8, 2004.
We owe it to those that we lost and to their loved ones and to our country to learn all that we can about that tragic day and the events that led to it.
And Bush and Vice President Cheney testified before the commission, too. Supporters of a January 6 commission hoped it might compel Donald Trump to testify. So now we might get a select congressional committee to investigate, and that is not without precedent. After all, the most famous one investigated Watergate.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
It was chaired by North Carolina Democrat Sam Ervin. Tennessee Republican Howard Baker was the ranking member of the Senate Watergate Committee, whose words have been immortalized.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
And that committee did get to the truth about Nixon. After World War II, the Senate investigated the intelligence failures leading up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Admiral of the Pacific Fleet in 1941, Husband Kimmel, testified in his own defense against charges of dereliction of duty, that he, along with the Army Lieutenant General Walter Short, had failed to anticipate the attack.
It was recognized that the Pacific Fleet was inferior to the Japanese fleet in every category of fighting ship. No one in authority expected that the Pacific Fleet could meet the Japanese head-on.
Kimmel and Short took the fall, and their reputations were shattered until the Senate in 1999 voted to clear their names after historians argued the two men were made scapegoats. And that 1946 Senate investigation also rejected the claim that President Roosevelt provoked or coerced Japan into attacking the U.S. in order to draw the nation into war, a claim for which there was no evidence. And over the decades, there have been commissions appointed directly by presidents. Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order creating the Warren Commission to investigate the JFK assassination. So when it comes to 1/6/2021, whether it's a commission created by Congress or a committee in Congress or an unlikely presidential panel, none would be perfect, but it would have an important mission to determine the truth. And it would seem to be in the interests of both Democrats and Republicans to establish an accurate and comprehensive record, especially at a time when conspiracy theories and crazy ideas are clouding our memory already. In May, just 4 months after he was seen barricading the doors to the House gallery to stop the mob from entering, Georgia Republican Congressman Andrew Clyde offered this version of what happened on January 6th.
Watching the TV footage of those who entered the Capitol and walked through Statuary Hall showed people in an orderly fashion staying between the stanchions and ropes taking videos and pictures. You know, if you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
And that's just one example of the gaslighting some people are engaging in to obscure the truth. So let's dig deeper into this now with historian and presidential scholar Alvin Felzenberg. He is the author of A Man and His Presidents, The Political Odyssey of William F. Buckley, Jr., and The Leaders We Deserved, Rethinking the Presidential Rating Game. And he was the chief spokesman for the 9/11 Commission. Alvin Felzenberg, welcome.
Thank you, Martin. It's always a pleasure to be with you and my friends at the Washington Times.
So when the mob attacked the Capitol on January 6th, did you consider at that time, or maybe shortly thereafter, that there might be calls for a commission to investigate it? Do you believe there should be a commission to investigate it?
Oh, two different questions. When I watched it, I couldn't believe my eyes. In the citadel of democracy, in a country that has been a beacon of hope, it was clear that it was not a peaceful demonstration, whatever one can call it. By the evening, by the time it was over, I began to think, well, maybe there will be calls for a commission. And then over time, impressions began to change and different stories began to appear, and it just seemed that someone, doesn't have to be a commission, but someone needs to get all this on the record. So yes, I thought there'd be something happening. I didn't know about a commission or not.
I'm assuming as a historian, you would like to see something come together here to get this on the record. Is that your position?
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, we can talk about the pros and cons of why a commission, but there needs to be a record of the events. Needs to be a factual summary of what happened that cannot be debated. I mean, we know the time it happened. We know some of the incidents. We have eyewitnesses' accounts. We have other issues of the day. Once we know all the facts, it doesn't have to be a commission, as I say. We can talk about it, but that leads to a series of recommendations that may stop this from happening again.
So just because it took place on our television screens and we're all watching it doesn't mean there's not more to investigate, right?
When we saw planes crash into the World Trade Center, that didn't tell us much about who sent them, and all we knew was that the World Trade Center was hit. It took several days, and eventually the debate to establish a commission and the commission itself to get at all the facts and then to pass the Intel Reform Bill of 2000, I think it was 2004 now, maybe 2005. That did create the DNI, and it did consolidate agencies and departments, and it did change the way they pass information. All these things were hopefully improved and cleared up, and thank the Lord we haven't had anything like 9/11 again. And we just can't move on until the questions are answered, until we knew exactly all that happened that day. We don't know it all yet.
And the 9/11 report is immense.
Yep.
It's still online. It reads like a history book. It establishes the official government record on what occurred, the roots of al-Qaeda, Sunni Islamist extremism, for instance. It would seem that a 1/6 or January 6 report would not entail as much work as the 9/11 Commission, and it should be something that our country can accomplish.
I would think so. We're not talking about foreign governments here. We are talking about security lapses. We are talking about different jurisdictions of law enforcement and who is in charge of what. Who is responsible for the U.S. Congress? I mean, it is owned by the U.S. government. The architect of the Capitol is involved, and GSA, I suspect, is involved. There are something like 90 law enforcement entities in Washington, D.C., and many people don't know that. We're talking beyond the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, beyond the National Guard, beyond the Army. And when something like this occurs, the question of not only why did it happen, which I don't think we all know, but how did it happen and how did it come on so long? These are legitimate concerns. And so there are certain issues that 9/11 dealt with, and I hope a commission or Congress itself can deal with.
So when you were on the staff of the 9/11 Commission, the political atmosphere in our country was different then. We had a moment of unity, not the hyper-partisanship that we have today. Right. After the attacks, There was a moment of unity. But politics eventually did return, and there were political challenges to forming the 9/11 Commission. Can you remind us of what some of those were?
Well, first of all, let's remember that while we were not as divided as we seem to be now, and I looked at a poll the other day, I forgot who did it, that no matter what your position is, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, whatever else you want to come up with, most people identify our disunity as a major problem facing the country. Most people think this is a problem, major problem. I haven't seen that before. So we go back to 2000 and 2001 when it happened. We're talking about 9 months after Bush versus Gore, of a president winning the electoral vote narrowly after a series of court cases that went on for 6 to 8 weeks. A very gracious concession speech by Al Gore, with the understanding that we have one president at a time, and he is the constitutional president, and Gore will bow to that and concede the election. Okay. There were very bad feelings all the way through as Bush was starting an administration. Would they cooperate with him? How would they not cooperate with him? Would he get his people through? Would he not? And I'd point out that the Senate was 50-50 like it is now. And towards the end of the first session, Senator Jeffers changed parties, essentially handed control of the Senate by one vote to the Democrats. So it wasn't what we have today, but it certainly wasn't the serenity of the Eisenhower years, when presidents seemed to get along very well with Sam Rayburn and LBJ, who was the Senate Majority Leader, and he seemed to work as well with the Democrats as did with the Republicans. So Bush's time was a very divided time, too. We came together for that one moment when they all sang God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol, or which you remember.
But also there were political considerations as far as the Bush administration, the Bush White House's fault.
Yes.
Whether there was fault there.
I'll let others go there, but I will say with the issues that I remember, I was not at the commission when it was being set up. Obviously not. I didn't even know I'd be part of this. Last thing I thought I would be doing. No sitting administration during a crisis wants to be investigated, particularly as the crisis is still going on. That is a legitimate concern. Trent Lott was the leader at the time, and he said, we've got a war on here. He's fighting a war in Afghanistan. He's increasing our military presence, and he shouldn't have to be bothered by asking questions of an investigatory group. We can do that after the war is won. That's not an unreasonable position to have. And they had a very skeptical view, which I think vanished over time. No question about that. And then the Democrats thought that in order to deflect attention from that, Republicans would try to blame everything on Clinton, because after all, Bush was only in for 9 months, and there were some issues that happened late in the Clinton administration that had the footprints of al-Qaeda all over it, including a terrorist attack on an American ship in the Mediterranean.
That's true, and whether or not Clinton may have missed an opportunity to kill bin Laden, I do remember.
Well, there were others, and yes, again, I'm not going there, but there were people who said that in order for the administration to deflect such criticism. They'd go after the other side. And okay, so therefore you asked about partisanship. There was skepticism on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue as to what it would do and was it necessary. The latter concerns faded about was it necessary because of the public opinion. Remember, you had 3,000 people died that day, and they all left behind someone. And it depends what you mean. You're talking about their businesses, their immediate families, their distant families, their colleagues, their college friends, roommates. Before you know it, you got several thousand people here who had somebody that died. And I'm from New Jersey, and I remember a young parish priest in a remote part of the state saying he had 9/11 burials in one day, 9 funerals. And many of those people and their representatives in Congress and the Senate began pushing the commission. And it was very hard to keep putting these people off. They had questions. They wanted answers. They wanted to know what I said as I started. How does a country of this strength and size leave itself so vulnerable? And so they were the wind behind whatever sails created the commission. It was extremely important.
And the 9/11 Commission had a lot of credibility because of ultimately who served on it. We had some real experts there who were able to get to the bottom of what happened.
I think that's right. You can look at their resumes. None of them were sitting elected officials. They had no other interests at all. They had one mission only. They weren't being interrupted by other businesses. They weren't leaving to go vote. They weren't going home to meet with constituents. They were doing one thing. And they bore in, and they had 12 public hearings, which is a way of instructing the American people on how we learn about all these people with names that were not familiar to us and practices and politics were not familiar to us, and how bin Laden and his minions, the people who carried it out, and they were able to rehearse what they did and see where the vulnerabilities in our security were and how they exploited them all. But the caliber of the people on the commission and on the staff was such that the families rallied behind it immediately.
Today, Republicans oppose creating the commission, at least to this point. It did not pass the Senate because Donald Trump doesn't want one, and many Republicans feel loyalty to him still.
Yeah.
The critics are saying that by opposing the formation of a commission, it's almost a tacit admission of culpability or complicity in what happened. What do you think of that?
Well, I'll let them speak to themselves. I don't know what Republicans you're talking about. I mean, it did pass the House. It did get Republican votes. And now the question of the Senate. There's always a question of the Senate taking it up again. This has happened in past time. And there might be some other changes that might be made in how it would operate that would assuage certain doubters.
Well, clearly Democrats, there's a political motive on their side as well. This will not make Donald Trump look good, or the Republicans who voted against certifying the election.
Again, I'm not going to get into that. If they want to define the Republican Party as whatever Donald Trump thinks or doesn't think, they have a right to, and they have a right to express that. But I find it on another level somewhat disturbing that their own lives are in jeopardy. And that question seems to matter less as time passes. It mattered a lot that day. We had people hiding under desks. We had people barricading themselves in offices. We had people reaching out to rescue other people of the other party. They thought were not as young and spry and fit in some cases and needed help. So those memories are also alive in my mind that I saw on television sometimes and on some of the shows at night. So I'll let them speak for themselves. I'm not an advocate here. I'm not a public politician or a public person.
Well, at this point, anyway, it does not look like Senate Republicans are going to change their minds. But in lieu of a commission, there are other ways, right, to establish the truth. There are news reports. There are law enforcement investigations. There could be a select committee in Congress.
Well, let me make one observation. You talk about Republicans before we get off this. 1972, Richard Nixon carried 49 states. It was the largest landslide in American history. All of his life, he had done a great deal of work for the Republican Party. He was the party's best workhorse in its history. I mean, year in, year out. He was a congressman. He was senator, vice president. He did a lot of the political work Eisenhower found distasteful or didn't want to do. He served with many people who then sat in his judgment on him in the Congress. In many of those cases, it broke their heart, changed their mind, and call on President Nixon to resign. And his standing in the Republican Party when the Watergate hearings began was still pretty high. so I'll just give you some parallels. Now, there are two select committees in American history that worked. There might have been many that did not work. The ones in the memory of your viewers or listeners would be the Select Committee on Watergate. Sometimes it's called the Ervin Committee. It was Sam Ervin and Howard Baker. And they worked like a hand in glove. They voted many times in opposite directions. And Baker was a protege of Richard Nixon. He actually considered him once vice president, maybe twice vice president. And he later became chief of staff to Reagan. I mean, his partisan credentials were as good as anybody's. And Ervin had come a long way. He had been the Southern Democrat who had written the Southern Manifesto that would allow courage public officials to resist the Brown versus Board of Education decision that declared separate but equal education unconstitutional. He came a long way, too. And they bonded very effectively. They had two counsel, you'll recall. One was Sam Dash, the Democrat counsel. The other one was Brett Thompson, the Republican counsel, who became a senator. And it was Frank Thompson's question of a fellow named Alexander Butterfield that released the information that the White House had a taping system. And Mr. Nixon began to find himself entangled in that struggle first for the tapes, and then when the tapes were made public, you saw Republican opinion and American opinion quickly change. But nobody said at that time that the Watergate Committee was politicized. Once they got to the evidence, and once they won the cases in the court about what the president had to release, the issue was over. Mm-hmm. Well, there's another period during World War II, and I'll be real fast on this one. It was called the Truman Committee. Now, one of the great myths in American history was that Harry Truman was a dark horse. You know, who's Truman? The Republicans used to yell when FDR put Truman on his ticket in 1944. Well, who's Truman had made the cover of Time magazine because of how well, in the middle of a world war, they investigated feather bedding at the Pentagon. And they started with the assumption that every American home is making sacrifices for the war. Every family we know has at least one son serving in uniform, or an uncle, or a cousin, or whatever. And if they're making the ultimate sacrifice, certain companies are not going to be getting rich in a war by milking the War Department for contracts that are inflated. And he worked with Republicans very well. They turned in a report. This is why he made the Time cover. And Franklin Roosevelt, same party as Truman, would later run with him, thanked them for saving the U.S. government something like $50 million that could go to support the soldiers. So we have had two select committees that work. Their records are still there in public documents in the Library of Congress, and if they want to see examples of them working, there are many of them.
And Congress investigated Pearl Harbor. It did produce a report that exonerated FDR from the allegations that he somehow left the Pacific Fleet deliberately in harm's way as an excuse to entering the war. But we often think about, moments of unity at times of war. Well, here we have the United States entering World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and some people willing to criticize their own president of essentially allowing Americans to be killed and American vessels to be sunk.
I can tell you a lot about the Roosevelt administration, a good deal of it positive, a good deal of it negative. I'd also point out, though, that we're talking about a president that, in spite of what the Congress found after the war, they exonerated him. I also point out he won 4 landslides and is still one of the most revered presidents. And people who have opinions and like to subscribe to conspiracy theories because they're easier to use to explain something than often the facts are. Yes, we'll say that. The people who thought that we shouldn't have gone into war, we shouldn't have invaded Britain, and he had a conspiracy to bring us into war and all of that, or that he tried to say, well, he can manipulate the Japanese into attacking us by leaving our whatever we had of a navy. We had the 17th largest navy in the world at that point. I think the Peruvians and the Brazilians had more ships in their navies than we did. Why would anybody leave your whatever you've got of a defensive navy in the center of harm's way to do what? To destroy your navy when the Japanese start conquering all of Asia and maybe Hawaii and maybe more? Yeah, they said this is rubbish and people are not going to believe it, and the majority never believed it. And that's it. Now, they did damage, though, because as Congress often does, they split the differences by holding accountable for negligence or not being at their post a certain admiral and a certain general, both of whose families sued the United States government for slander for many years, and they did prevail. I point that out.
Interesting. Yeah, and there, of course, were legitimate angles of investigation when it came to Pearl Harbor. From November 1945 through May of 1946, the Senate Committee. Testimony from 44 people, including top-level military commanders and diplomats. And they had 14,000 pages of printed exhibits. So in the end, commissions, whether there should be a 1/6 commission or not, they serve a really legitimate purpose. And obviously, as a historian, you would love to have an official record from which to do research.
We need the record, and in the case of 9/11, they made recommendations. I would like to say that I think there were 40, I have to think back 20 years now, there were 40 recommendations. And actually, the major one has not been enacted to this day. Congress being a fuller partner in how we gather intelligence, how we hold intelligence agencies to account, and how they can share power with the executive if they don't want this to be only a presidential, or even I'd say a Caesar kind of nation. And if you go back and look, previous presidents did consult Congress all the time about military strategy. Consult is not the same as consent. Consult. And Congress played deep roles in World War II, and some of the wars after that began to break down during Vietnam. But on the intelligence side, we had a number of recommendations on how Congress could be a stronger partner, and maybe the tragedies now would allow it, with his own house at risk, to take some action on it.
Alvin Felzenberg, we thank you for your historical perspective. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Bibi, Iran, and the bomb.
By next spring, at most, by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
Since the early 1990s, over and over again, Benjamin Netanyahu warned the world that Iran was this close to having nuclear weapons. 30 years later, Bibi is out of power, but his legacy on Iran, his imprint on U.S.-Israeli relations, lives on. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.